and highly consequential endeavor to catalyze climate action in a spirit of candor, collaboration, and courage. Let us imagine a pathway for different financial structures that can deliver on Africa's goals. Let us commit to invest in viable solutions presented by renewable energy, green industrialization, climate-smart agriculture, and nature conservation. I am confident that we are all inspired by the possibilities before us and galvanized by the demands of this critical time to engage productively, collaborate successfully, and conclude the Africa Summit with a Nairobi Declaration on green growth and climate finance agenda that will commit us to pursue a climate-positive path to propel Africa's economy and promote job creation in a manner that limits our emissions and aids global decarbonization efforts. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends, this summit is a moment to imagine a bold and radically affirmative African future. We are here to envision a continent that links markets and connects resources with demand, unlocking massive economies of scale, a continent that offers an economic backbone for a decarbonized world, a continent that thrives and shapes climate-proof future for all. So, as we immerse ourselves into the array of complex issues during the summit, let us fix our gaze firmly upon the horizon of possibilities. The future is not just something to hope for. Neither is it something to merely wish or wait for. The future is for us to conceptualize and actualize, starting now. That is what we have come to do at the Africa Climate Summit. Welcome to the future, and I thank you.
One more round of applause to all the speakers who have spoken so well. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Now we've come to the end of this session, so mine is just to give you some exit protocols. Very simply, we're going to have what we call a family photo with His Excellency, the President. And so we are inviting the AU leadership and all the ministers, including our cabinet secretaries, to join His Excellency for this photo. So what we'll do is that at the point we're exiting, kindly let's allow His Excellency and the leadership to exit first, followed by the ministers. I'll request that we all remain in the room. Then after that, we will be free to take a short break. But for now, we'll all be upstanding kindly as we allow His Excellency, the President, the AU leadership, and the ministers to proceed to the photo shoot. The photo will be taken at the main entrance to KICC. We do have some protocol officers who are going to guide us on that. So we proceed to the main entrance of KICC, where we have an arrangement for all the ministers together with His Excellency the President to take the family photo. Otherwise, have yourselves a wonderful rest of the day.
Bila shaka mtazamaji, hili ni kongamano la mabadiliko ya tabia nchi ambalo limeng'oa rasmi na limeweza kuzinduliwa na Rais wa taifa hili Dr. William Ruto, akiwakaribisha tu wajumbe
And Catherine will introduce her panelists. Over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Excellencies, distinguished guests, friends new and old. It's an honor to be with you today in this beautiful country, my first time. And it is our imperative to talk about this critical topic, how to scale international climate finance for Africa. President Ruto said a few moments ago that trillions of dollars are looking for green. Let me repeat that. Trillions of dollars are looking for green. This session is about unlocking those trillions. Before turning to the first panel today, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our distinguished keynote speaker, the CEO of Africa 50, Mr. Alain Ebobisse, and he'll set the scene for today's discussion. A big round of applause.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, all protocol observed, it's a true honor to be here today at the inaugural Africa Climate Summit. It's always a thrill, really, to be at events like this where Africa is in the driving seat to solve its challenges, define its sustainable growth path, of course, working together with our international and global partners. Today's session covers two themes that are critical to scale up climate investment into Africa and to reduce the cost of capital, namely innovative financing instruments and policy support to drive climate investment. The organization that I lead, Africa 50, sits at the nexus of these two worlds, private sector and government, serving as a platform to making bankable infrastructure projects a reality in Africa. So how do we scale up international climate finance for Africa and at the same time, it's quite important, reduce the cost of capital for climate-friendly projects? First, it's important that the continent continues to improve its macroeconomic environment and also the regulatory context, to improve its attractiveness of the investment climate of our dear continent. The goal here should be to reach investment grade status with the investment grade credit rating from the global agencies such as Fitch, Moody's, S&P. I think if we get there, this will undoubtedly help in reducing the cost of capital and enable countries to access large pools of global capital. Now, some countries in Africa are already making very good progress in this space, but we have to acknowledge that this is a medium to long-term goal because it takes time to get to the investment grade status. In the meantime, what do? We must cater for the growing infrastructure needs and make projects more affordable to people and businesses. I see a number of levers that we can use to attract capital successfully and reduce its cost, some of which we at Africa 50, we are already working on these levers. Allow me to focus on infrastructure, which is the mandate of Africa 50, and it is also a space that requires a massive amount of investment. First, we need to increase the amount of blended finance and concessional money available to fund infrastructure projects in Africa. We must get to the point where combining private capital with blended funds will reduce in lowering the average cost of capital, especially for projects with a high cost, upfront cost of capital. In this context, we cannot emphasize enough the critical importance of reaching the $100 billion that was pledged by to developing countries by the global north. I will argue that this target should even be increased to cater for the growing needs of the continent. Indeed, as the time passes, we see an acceleration of negative impact of climate change on Africa. So assuming that the $100 billion target is reached or even exceeded, which I hope, more effort should be focused on creating initiatives that will help channel that money effectively to climate adaptation and mitigation infrastructure projects. One of those examples is ASIA, the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa, that will launch at the COP27 together with the African Union Commission, the Africa Development Bank, and Africa 50. The goal is to raise $500 million of blended finance to develop projects and to catalyze $10 billion of private capital in green infrastructure. So we would continue to push for Asia because this is the kind of initiative, bold initiative that we need to do to drive international capital into Africa. Second lever, risk mitigation. I think I would like to highlight that because, of course, there are already a number of risk mitigation instruments which are used today, delivered by MIGA, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, partial risk guarantees, etc. This instrument enable to cover some of the risk, thereby reducing the cost of capital because the investor will require lower cost of capital. But what we need to do is to use those instruments a bit more. Today, we are not using enough of this instrument, and we have to make them more user-friendly. We have to make them deployable a bit more efficiently. And very important, some of the macro risk that actually the private sector is uncomfortable with, namely foreign exchange risk. We need to come up with new instruments to address the foreign exchange rate. Now, the perceived risk is also, and President Ruto was mentioning that today, the perceived risk in Africa is higher than actual risk, and we need to make sure that we're able to work to reduce the perceived risk by talking about our success stories. Even here in Kenya, fantastic project that the Lake Turkana project, 310 megawatt wind project was done right here in Kenya. Fantastic example. We can talk about the 1.5 gigawatt solar farm in Egypt, Bemban. Many other examples. Another example that I should mention is the transmission line PPP that Africa 50 is working on with the government of Kenya to bring power from the renewable rich regions to the demand centers. This will be the first of this kind in Africa, and this is the kind of project that we need to celebrate to reduce the perception, because a lot of things are happening. We have to acknowledge our challenges, but we have a lot of things, good things that are happening. I will conclude my remarks with two things. Well-prepared projects, well-developed projects attract lower cost of capital. So this is why project preparation and project development is so important. We must allocate more resources to project development and project preparation. At Africa 50, we have a dedicated project development fund. It's less than $100 million, so it's small. We need a lot more resources to project preparation and project development, not only the financial resources, but also the skills and capabilities. And finally, we must mobilize domestic and regional capital. It's not enough to attract international capital. We need to continue to do so, but we need to tap our domestic and regional resources. The African Development Bank estimates that about $2 trillion of asset under management by African institutional investors. Just tapping a fraction of that could help actually make a difference. And this is what we are doing at Africa 50. Recently, about a month ago, we managed to gather 17 African institutional investors to back our Africa 50 Infrastructure Acceleration Fund, a $500 million fund. 17 African institutional investors came together to do this. It's a beginning. We'll do more, but we need to do this. Finally, speed. We've talked about a number of levers. We say that we must attract international capital. This is all good, but one commitment that we should make, all of us, government, the private sector, DFIs, is to act faster. We should not be seeking for perfection. We should implement projects with a sense of urgency, because doing nothing or delaying projects costs money. So by speeding up implementation, we can build a better Africa, a more resilient and climate-friendly Africa. We thank you. Absolutely.
So inspiring. Thank you so much.
One more round of applause for Alan. What an incredibly inspiring message. It's now my privilege to ask the first panel speakers to come up to the stage. I'll introduce you as you walk up, but it is such a privilege to moderate this panel of unbelievable leaders who've inspired me over the past couple of years as we talk about this topic, blended finance, reducing the cost of capital, and investing in climate action. First, we've got South Africa's Minister of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries, Barbara Creasy. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Please join us on stage. Second, and I'm so sorry to cut the beautiful music short. Second, we've got Minister Dan Jørgensen from Denmark, Minister for Development, Cooperation and Global Climate Policy. Third, we've got Mimi Elemehu, 3 Cans Group Senior Advisor, former OPIC and former Black Rhino. Please join us. Fourth, we've got Dennis Denyer, Afri-Exim Bank Executive Vice President. Please join us, Dennis. And finally, we've got Ruud Brouwer, the CEO of TCX, the currency exchange. Please join us. And as our speakers are making their way to the stage, I just wanted to remind you of one thing which Alain actually said a couple of weeks ago, and I was fortunate enough to hear him, but he didn't say it today, so I thought I would share it. Alain said, "We have an opportunity cost of delayed action." That's brilliant framing for the 2 panels that we have here today. The first, which is going to focus on de-risking instruments, tackling some of those cost of capital challenges, which President Ruto mentioned earlier, and figuring out the blended finance solutions to unlock capital for climate. And the second of which will talk about the policy and enabling environment to unlock that investment, as Alain said, both domestic and international. But if we think about the opportunity cost of delayed action, then I'm not going to lie to this room, we have delayed. We are not winning. Africa alone needs $250 billion a year to address climate goals in the next decade. Only about 12% of that is flowing. And of that 12%, less than 15% comes from the private sector. And that is compared to over 70% in developed economies. That's not right, and that can't stand. But we also know that countries lose between 5 and 15% of GDP. 5 and 15% of GDP due to the impacts of climate and their negative impacts on communities. So it sounds like we should be depressed. I don't want to depress you, and in fact, the fortunate thing about this incredibly inspiring panel is that we can shift into an opportunity mode and hold that challenge of not having an opportunity cost of delayed action, but of moving faster. We are in this beautiful continent with 60% of the world's solar resources, 70% of the world's cobalt, the highest proportion of young people under 30 in the world, 5% of global lithium resources, and enough green hydrogen potential to produce 50 million tons a year and unlock $1 trillion of investment. Africa, as we know, has forests that remove more carbon than the Amazon, lands and oceans that produce food for the world. And with the majority of the talent in this room and on this panel, I'm certain we can shift to an opportunity framing. I'm certain that we can talk about the potential. I'm certain we can talk about action. And with that, it is my absolute privilege to invite Minister Creasy to share some reflections. I know that you have been involved in the global stocktake, and it would be wonderful to hear what are people saying, what are they asking for when we look at where we're at and where we need to go and how we finance it.
Good morning to everybody, and allow me to congratulate our hosts for the warm reception we have received and for finally bringing about Africa's first climate summit. I suppose that the reason that we have to talk about the past is that it helps us to better understand where we are today. And as you've correctly pointed out, action with regard to climate finance has been delayed. We're still waiting for the 100 billion. We have had a commitment for the doubling of adaptation finance, But as yet, I'm sometimes tempted to say doubling nothing is still nothing. So what's the problem on the table? The problem on the table is we have this enormous opportunity, but the African continent is unable to realize the opportunity because the major form of finance we need is in the adaptation area, and it's specifically in the area of infrastructure. Without infrastructure, it becomes enormously difficult to exploit the vast resources that exist on our country. And so, because we haven't received the mitigation financing, and we're yet to see the adaptation financing, we are unfortunately pushed into the loss and damage area. And you would all know that last year, ahead of the UNFCCC meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh, there was significant research done. That particular piece of research, which is known as the Stern-Songwe High-Level Expert Panel Report, indicated that by 2030, we could be looking at something like 300 billion in loss and damage. So how do we move from there? Well, of course, the first issue is that we need to see significant and new grant financing, because it's only through this grant financing that we will begin to unlock private financing that could exist for investment. Why is that? Well, first of all, you've already heard that most of African countries, including ourselves, are no longer at investment grade. So the cost of borrowing in an already heavily debted nation like South Africa is exorbitant, and we unfortunately are not in a position to do it. So what it means is that we need a new suite of financial instruments that would first of all allow us to deal with debt, the debt burden in our societies, and secondly, instruments that would allow us to start to scale up the investments that you've talked about. What's the problem there? The fundamental problem is who is going to finance the first loss. If we're going to start to invest in technologies that as yet have not been realized, like green hydrogen, where is the financing for first loss going to come from? We do have, as we heard from President Ruto, enormous potential in terms of our carbon sinks, but natural capital accounting is still a new science, and payment for ecosystem services is still something that is not globally accepted as a revenue source. So these are possible new areas of finance, and I suppose today what we've got to discuss is whether we have the appetite for the reform of the MDBs, whether we have the appetite to address the real indebted situation that Africa is in, and how through really addressing that situation we can start to attend to the important opportunities that exist. Thank you very much.
Minister, thank you so much, and for your leadership constantly of calling out fit for purpose climate finance, especially around the debt agenda. Just before I move to Minister Jørgensen, are you hopeful that there is that ambition for reform?
Well, we all live in hope. It's what keeps us going, isn't it?
Minister Jørgensen, are you hopeful? You obviously have a huge responsibility sitting here as the donor voice, and an interesting lesson from Denmark about transition. Are you hopeful?
I am hopeful, but I'm primarily hopeful because I've decided to be so. Because if we look at the actual numbers and we look at the speed of which things are moving forward, unfortunately there's a lot of things that needs to be improved, and it's going too slow. So why am I choosing to be hopeful? Well, I think if decision makers don't choose to be hopeful and don't choose to have visions, then there's no way of us reaching these targets. I like to use the example also that if we look at the civil rights movement in the United States of America, Martin Luther King, he did not start a revolution by giving a speech called, "I have a nightmare," right? Similarly, we need to focus on the positive aspects. Now, having said that, I will start with a somewhat bleak analysis. Looking at what's been possible to mobilize and finance the last decade, we are so far from where we need to be. Going back to 2009 at COP15 in Copenhagen, my own country, it was decided that from 2020 to 2025, we needed to mobilize 100 billion a year in climate financing. Now, hopefully we will reach that target this year, but that's 3 years too late. And fact of the matter is that even if we manage that, we're talking 100 billion. And we know for a fact that we need trillions. For Africa alone, we need probably around 250 billion a year. So we need to do something fundamentally different. Most obvious point that Barbara also made was that we need more public grants from developed countries. I mean, the United Nations recommends 0.7% in development aid every year. And my own country, Denmark, has been allocating that for more than 40 years now, so we would definitely also urge other countries to follow that. But we also need to look at how that money is then spent. And I think there's big potential for spending the money wiser. First of all, we need to recognize that development, fight against poverty, fight against hunger, fight for education, fight for economic growth, all of these things are today interlinked with the climate agenda. So this means that we also need to align our spending of development aid with this. So that's my first point. My second point here is public money and public grants are also very well used as a de-risker of investment. So as the President alluded to earlier in his excellent speech, it is actually a paradox that there's a lot of money out there, billions and billions from institutional investors wanting to be invested in green purposes. So why doesn't it happen? Well, one of the reasons is that the risks are often too big. So maybe if we spend our public money de-risking the investments of the private sector, that can open up for a big influx of needed capital. I do have some good news for you today, if that's okay, because we have just in Denmark put forward the government our proposal for next year's fiscal law, so our budget for the next year. And in that we have put forward a suggestion, a proposal to double our funding of the Global Green Climate Fund. We think that that's an extremely important fund. Thank you. The GCF is doing a great job, both with regards to adaptation and mitigation, and we would urge others to follow that example. Thank you so much.